Hello, everyone. I want to say some things about this essay by James van Evra, Death as a Limit, which I've asked you to read. Let me begin just by reading, if this works, the opening paragraph of the essay. He says this, phenomenally speaking, and maybe I'll say a few words about his use of the words phenomenally and phenomenal, which is actually quite difficult, I think. Phenomenally speaking, dying is simply a matter of ceasing to think and experience. And death is presumably the state of such experiencelessness. But while it seems perfectly reasonable to describe death in this way, to do so invites some potentially troublesome questions. And those questions are conceptual questions, or philosophical questions, or logical questions. They're not ethical questions or moral questions or questions about meaning. They're questions about problems that are raised in trying to coherently conceive of what death is. Just to say that again, he says, but while it seems perfectly reasonable to describe death in this way, that is, as a state of experiencelessness, to do so invites some potentially troublesome questions. For instance, it might be asked whether there need be anything which phenomenal death as a state characterizes. In describing death as a state, that is, are we tacitly committed to accepting the personal survival of death in the sense that we need something of which we can say that it once thought and experienced, but while still existing, does no longer? On the other hand, if we do not recognize the existence of experienceless selves, can sense be made of talking about phenomenal death as a state at all? Those are some pretty difficult questions, frankly, that he raises there. But they give you a sense of what really prompts this essay, what this essay's main theme or main goal is, and that is simply to find a way to characterize death which is sensible and which answers to our ordinary talk and thinking about death, but which does not commit us to the seemingly contradictory idea of an experienceless self, that is, a self which somehow exists in some way, but has no experience whatsoever, has no sensation, no perception, no awareness. I think that what Van Evra is motivated by is by the absurdity or logical contradiction, the inconceivability of such a self. That is, to be a self is to be aware of something, to have some, let's say, some mental content, some mental activity, some activity of some kind, and to be an experienceless self would seem to be a rather contradictory idea. So I think one of the ways you can think of this essay is that Van Evra is trying to find a way to really define death or to characterize death in such a way that we can avoid thinking about things that are dead as being real things. That is, as the dead as being still being selves, still being somethings of a certain sort, but being experienceless somethings that have no experience whatsoever. And his alternative to thinking about those experienceless selves is to characterize death as a limit. And I think that here, if you have read the Epicurus, you should be helped, because he's basically an Epicurean with regard to his notion of death. And if you haven't read it, you should probably go overlook it. It's a very short text, and it's a very key text, I think, in any philosophy course on death. Is Epicurus's famous claim that death is nothing to us, and that death is nothing to us because death is the end of all sensation and awareness. And one might say, in the language that Van Evra is using, it's the end of all experience. So you might say that what Van Evra is doing is just sort of filling out and giving a more detailed interpretation of the Epicurean view of death as nothing, and as the dead are nothing. They're not selves that in some way continue after death, but without any awareness, any experience whatsoever, that the dead truly are nothing, then what is death? Well, death is the limit to all experience, and the key here, the beginning point, is Van Evra's use of a very famous thing that the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein said about 100 years ago in his Tractatus, where he compares death to the so-called limit of our visual field. And that's where we'll begin in the second essay.